The Holodomor in Ukraine in 1932-1934 as example of a genocide. The causes, characteristics, manifestations, and modern interpretations. The Holodomor of 1932-1933 in Soviet Ukraine remains one of the most contested mass tragedies of the 20th century, particularly regarding its illegal classification as a genocide. I analyzed the causes, mechanism, and consequences of the famine to assess whether it constitutes a deliberate attempt to destroy the Ukrainian nation in whole or in part. Using the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention and R.Lemkin's concept of Soviet genocide as analytical frameworks, the study situated the Holodomor with Stalinist policies of forced collectivization, dekulakization, grain requisitions, and political repressions. Although collectivizations affected the entire USSR, Ukraine experienced a uniquely severe and targeted implementation. Excessive procurement quotas, criminalizations of food retentions under the so-called 5 years of corn law, blacklisting of villages, restrictions of peasants' mobility, and systematic denial of relief transformed famine into an instrument of state coercion. These measures coincided with the assault on Ukraine's national life, including purges of the Ukraine Communist Party, repression of intelligence, liquidations of the Ukraine Orthodox Church, demographic engineering, and the rollback of Ukrainization policies. Mortality data show significant regional disparities, with central Ukrainian oblasts suffering disproportional losses, reinforcing the argument that policy outcomes were neither accidental nor uniform. I engage critically with interpretations that describe the Holodomor as an unintended consequence of economic mismanagement, addressing claims regarding insufficient intent and elegant relief efforts. These explanations fail to account for the convergence of famine policies with a broader campaign against Ukrainian political autonomy and cultural identity. The Holodomor meets the criteria of genocide as defined by international law. The Soviet government enforced forcible collectivization in 1930, depriving peasants of all property and igniting rural Ukrainian resistance organizations. The Soviet government used the possibility of an alliance between Ukrainian nationalists and the peasants' resistance as justification for the repressions of Ukrainians. The Soviets would cause a widespread famine among Ukrainians. The atrocity was dubbed the Holodomor by Ukrainians. As the Soviet authorities maintained, were these planned famines the unfortunate outcome of forced collectivization and the suppression of peasant opposition? Or were they the product of a conscious attempt to eradicate Ukrainian identity? It's important to review legal and international accepted definition of genocide. The United Nations decided during the Genocide Convention of December 1949 that genocide is a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in a part. R.Lemkin, a legal scholar, in a speech delivered in 1953, called the USSR policies toward Ukraine under Stalin the classic example of Soviet genocide. He understood it is a series of actions that also included the destructions and subjugations of Ukraine's intellectual and political elite, the liquidations of independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the government-directed settlement of Ukrainians' farmlands by non-Ukrainians, which took place in the wake of a famine 1932-1933. There are other opinions. Until December 2022, European Parliament had only recognized the Holodomor as a crime against humanity, not a genocide. Historians Stefan Whitcroft and Davis argue against classifying the Holodomor as a genocide, focusing on intent, citing economic complications, as well as the secret relief efforts carried out by the Soviet government. Stefan Wittkopf, for instance, argues that those who argue that the Holodomor was a genocide do not recognize the economic complexity of a context, adding that there was not an easy solution that Stalin could have implemented to stop the famine. The famine started in 1929. Then Soviet leader Stalin decided to collectivize agriculture. Theoretically, Stalin could have regulated the production and consumption of grain by collectivizing agriculture. He intended to use the grain to boost industrialization and bolster the Red Army. When Stalin introduced his first 5-year plan in 1928, he knew that the peasants would oppose collectivization and that his revolution from above would inevitably turn into war against the peasantry. He was aware that the main resistance would come from Ukraine and the largely Ukraine Kuban, two of the three main grain productions regions of USSR. Stalin steadily established himself as the strong man of the USSR in the late 1920s. As he ascended to autocratic authority, he exterminated his opponents one by one. He promoted the expansion of kolkhozes and the collectivization of rural agriculture. This agricultural program was disastrous. The peasants were underpaid, they disregarded the collective farms, output fell, and there were food shortage across Russia. Stalin believed that this was a sign of a peasant landowners' disobedience to the Soviet government. His response, which resulted in unheard-of levels of brutality, set the stage for the division of descent Soviets from the so-called backward peasants. He contrasted the USSR's rural existence with the pre-revolutionary Russia. Along with capitalists and members of religious organizations, he labeled peasants landowners as kulaks and listed them as one of the three main groups of advertisers of revolution. The kulaks were portrayed by Stalin's government as a class that hoarded agricultural reserves, starved the populace, and undermined the Soviet revolution. Since they stood to lose the most, the kulaks, curriculi in Ukrainian, opposed collectivizations with the greatest obstinacy. Stalin anticipated that the impoverished peasants would view the kulaks as the enemies of their class and assist the government in seizing their property to benefit the kolkhoz. On 27 December 1929, he announced that conditions were ripe for the elimination of kulaks as a class. After being forced from their houses, the kulaks were either deported to the Russians' far north, relocated to another regions of the nation, or given poorer land outside the kolkhoz. The head of the Ukrainian party, Stanislav Kosior, stated in 1934 that his country had dekulakized 200,000 families, or almost 1 persons. Ukraine lost its greatest farmers, the guardians of its national spirits and culture, as a result of dekulakization. Socially, it means that the peasants' nature leaders in their struggle against the oppressive government had been lost. In November 1929, only 522,000 or 10.4% out of a total 5 million Ukrainian households were members of a collective farms. The escalation of a plan pushed its realization to 30.7% by February 1, 1930, and to 62.8% with a 68.5% at the arable land 5 weeks later. Farmers, wealthy and poor alike, rebelled in any manners they could. Kolkhozes accounted for 72% of the arable land and 68% of Ukrainian householders by October 1931. 87% of households were collectivized in the steppe region that produced grain. Both the private and individual farms and socialized collective farm sectors were subject to high grain procurement quotas. The expropriation of a peasant's grain was implemented by the same individuals who had pushed the peasants into kolkhozes and banished kulaks. Stalin anticipated that exports would rise, state purchase would rise, and grain production would increase. The Soviet authorities mistakenly believed that social farming would be just as productive and successful as private farming. The total amount of grain produced decreased by almost 15 million tons in 1931. Poor crops were partially caused by unfavorable weather, but the state's fierce conflict with the agricultural producers in both the public and private sectors was the primary cause of a downturn. Farmers feel taken advantage of. Negligence and indifferences predominated. Sabotage went up. In the fields, a lot of grain was wasted during transportation and threshing. As the peasants fought against their captivity, famine emerged as a new threat. They were aware of their situation after learning about the high procurement quotas. They still had some reserved in 1929 and 1930, but by 1931 they had run out, and the high delivery quotas they were subjected to left them with a little left over for food, animal feed, and seed for following growing season. Approximately 3.9 million Ukrainians perished in the Holodomor, accounting for a sizable share of the country's then 29.6 million inhabitants. These fatalities were distributed differently throughout the Ukrainian USSR. The central Ukrainian oblasts of Kiev and Kharkiv had more than twice as many fatalities as Vinnytsia, the oblast with the second highest death toll. The agricultural oblasts of Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk were the least impacted. Stalin refused to admit that the famine was taking place in Ukraine, despite the obvious and complete destruction of the Ukrainian countryside. He actually singled out Ukrainian as being disloyal, claiming that Ukrainian nationalists were to blame for the events in the Soviet Ukraine, and that they should be punished. 1932 is also when the Soviet policy takes a specific and unmistakably murderous turns against the Republic of Soviet Ukraine. In earlier July 1932, Ukrainian communist delegates rejected Moscow's unrealistic plan, which requires the collection of 32% of all harvests. Russian communist leader Molotov and Kaganovich arrived in Ukraine to reason with their Ukrainian comrades, who have finally capitulated. In August 1932, the Ukrainian Communist Party, kolkhoz leaders and Ukrainian intellectual elite were purged of all nationalist elements. Almost 100,000 elements who rejected Stalin's plan were arrested. However, this was futile. Stalin's plan was impossible to implement. Stalin started to design an appropriate system to guarantee that this directive on the delivery of grain would be fulfilled. The notorious 5-year of corn law was the outcome. In July 20, letter to Kaganovich and Molotov, the General Secretary suggested a 3-part ordinance to stop widespread stealing by dekulakized kulaks and others. A. Make railroad freight, collective farm property and cooperative property equal with the state property. B. Make theft of any of them punishable by minimum of 10 years imprisonment and, as a rule, by death. And C. Revoke the right of amnesty for the 3 criminal acts. Stalin's murderous plan were intended to be enforced by the legal system. The party state decree titled on the protection of property of state enterprises, collective farms and cooperatives, and on the consolidation of public socialist property, was released on August 7, 1932. It became the primary legal tool used to carry out Stalin's orders that millions of farmers starved to death. Stalin brandished the specters of Ukrainian separatism. He intended to strengthen his rule in Ukraine and transform it into real fortresses of USSR. Otherwise, he insisted, we may lose Ukraine. Ukraine needed a strong hand to prevent an alliance between the Communist Party of Ukraine and the peasants. On November 2, 1932, after securing Stalin's approval, Molotov forced a resolution through the Ukrainian government consisting of two sets of measures: the confiscation of grain and edibles and the repression of all opposition. Hundreds of villages that did not achieve the collection objectives were placed on the blacklist in October and November of 1932. As a result, enterprises were shut down, loans were requested, and the quotas for the collection of potatoes and meats were increased by the factor of 15. The kolkhozes were made to repay advance in kind on November 18, and the penalized peasants were deprived of the freedom to the purchase and sell on the open market. The property legislation of August 7th was implemented by special troikas and itinerant courts. Stalin issued an order on December 14th to restrict the use of Ukrainian language and stop Lenin's Ukrainization strategy. Molotov and Kaganovich signed a pact on December 29 and forbade helping the peasants and required the gathering of seed stores to be stored for the following year. Stalin issued an edict on January 1, 1933, charging anybody who concealed and food with the theft of a social property. The punishment for offenders might be death or 10 years in an internment camp. Stalin was notified on January 21 by the head of Ukrainians OGPU that many Ukrainian peasants were trying to escape the country by train. Stalin commanded the installation of barricades and the banning of the sale of rail tickets to peasants in the days that followed. The peasants were forced to perish in their communities. There was obviously a political attempt to use hunger as a weapon of mass destruction in Ukraine. Food requisitions were raised despite rising rate of famine, and relief was not given in enough amounts. The crisis peaked in the winter of 1932-1933, when organized policy and communist apparatchiks looted everything edible from peasants' households, including crops, personal food, supplies, and pets. These acts were motivated by hunger and terror, but they were also strengthened by almost 10 years of bitter and conspiratorial speech coming from the Kremlin top brass. The 1930-1931 harvests yielded the bigger amounts that the state was able to collect. However, the 1932 crop was meager, yielding just 80.5 million. Stalin blended the struggle against nationalism with the struggle for bread and gave it expression in the secret decree titled on grain procurement in Ukraine, the North Caucasus and the Western Oblast. Signed on 14 December 1932, the document outlined 3 tasks: A. To solve the problem of grain procurement, B. To fight infiltrations by counter-revolutionary elements, and C. To curtail Ukrainization. The abandoned structures, tools, and livestock would be given to demobilized Russian Red Army soldiers, who would then settle in the cleared air. The paper attributed the problems with the grain supply to Ukrainization. Supporters of a Kubani Rada, Petlurites, and bourgeois nationalists had established their own cells and organizations joined party and state institution, and held positions as directors, accountants, storekeepers, foremen in communal farms and village Soviet members. They had been able to undermine their planting and harvesting activities as a result. These counter-revolutionary individuals were to be eliminated and either executed or sent to detention camps by the party and state authorities in Ukraine and the North Caucasus. Stalin's struggle against the Ukrainians culminated in the horrific year of 1933. The farmers of Ukrainian SSR and the ethnically Ukrainian heirs of RSFSR were particularly susceptible to the new wave of the destructive activities of a communist dictatorship because they were physically worn out from years of hardship and exploitation. Millions of people perished from starvation, cold, and related illnesses throughout 1933's winter, spring, and summer. Repression from earlier times was stepped up. Deportations and dekulakalizations, no actual kulak remained, persisted, albeit on reduced scale and mostly for political reasons. The victims were weaker and less able to fight, yet arrests, beatings, and other forms of cruelty continued to flourish. Peasants were told to stop using all borders crossing between Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and the rest of USSR. All farmers attempted to escape Ukraine and the North Caucasus were to be arrested by the GPU, and after the counter-revolutionary forces were isolated, the other farmers were to be returned to their communities. The best proof of a dictator's intention